All right, so we're reaching the part of the calendar where the All Star festivities are over, and we're now careening towards the NBA playoffs. We've got a pretty good idea of who the best teams are at this point, and of who the best players on those teams are, too. And sometime in June, one of those players, whether it's Giannis or KD or Nikola Jokic or somebody else, will be chosen as the league's MVP. It's the most prestigious individual award that the sport can give out, and getting selected even once is usually enough to catapult you into the Hall of Fame conversation. If you look at a list of the winners, even just going back to 2000, you'll see names like LeBron, Steph Curry, Shaq, Kobe, Allen Iverson, Tim Duncan, and Steve Nash. Some of the absolute best that the sport has ever had to offer. But there's one name that sticks out among all of those, and not in the sense that you might hope. Back in 2010, there was no hotter name in the world of basketball than Derrick Rose. Sure, LeBron had just won back to back MVPs and was just a year away from getting his first title, but in a league that was rapidly becoming more and more LeBron centric, Derrick Rose and his Bulls team were the perfect foil. And Rose was a transcendent talent all on his own. He was big, fast, athletic, and a prolific scorer. He may not have been a favorite of the analytics department, but it's hard to argue with the guy who averages 25, 8, and 4 on what a lot of people thought was the best team in the league. Him leading his hometown team to glory was almost too perfect. And even though they did end up losing to LeBron's Heat team in the conference finals, it seemed like Rose and his team's stock was only going to go up from there. But then the 2012 playoffs happened. In the first game of their first round series against the Sixers, Derrick Rose drove into the lane like he had 1,000 times before, pro hop to his right to get a shot away, and bang. Torn left ACL, done for the rest of the season. Now, if you've been a fan of the NBA for a while, you know what happened next. Without their best player, the Bulls dropped that first round series in 6 games, even though they were the number one seed. And even though he's gone on to have a perfectly respectable and even really good career at various points, Rose never returned to that MVP level he'd shown he was capable of before he got injured. It certainly doesn't help that he's torn the meniscus in his other knee twice since, or that he's missed time for a litany of other injuries. But as a student of psychology, I couldn't help but wonder if there might be some other explanation underlying all of that. What if Derrick Rose's injury recovery had less to do with him having glassy joints and more to do with what was going on in his brain? See, people tend to think of playing sports as a predominantly physical thing, but it's very much not. Aside from all the strategy and social engagement that goes on during a game, any movement that you perform, voluntarily or otherwise, is going to be ordered by your central nervous system, which your brain is a part of. Your sensory neurons receive information from your environment, then pass that stuff along to your central nervous system, which then figures out what to do next. Whether it's catching a ball being thrown at you or trying to decide which side of the court to return a serve to, strictly speaking, you can't do anything without your brain first deciding what needs to be done. All of this stuff, problem solving skills, the ability to process stimuli, memory, imagination, all of it can be filed under what's known in psychology as a person's cognition. And more research is being done every year on how cognition affects an athlete's decision making, and subsequently, their injury history. To try and understand a little bit more about all this, I reached out to Dr. Gus Allmanmotor, who's a professor of biomechanics and motor control at Wisconsin La Crosse. Gus and his team were one part of a series of 4 different studies, all looking at the effects of fatigue on biomechanical decision making, and how that might leave high level athletes vulnerable to certain injuries.
For a long time, when we consider, common athletic injuries like mainly ACL injuries and stuff like that, there's a lot of efforts going in to try to prevent them because the outcomes aren't good even after surgery. They're very costly, things like that. So there's a lot of groups looking at, what are factors that contribute to ACL injury risk and stuff like that. And a lot of times it's been from a pure mechanical perspective. Like, how do people move in a way that puts strain on the ligament or puts them at risk for injury?
But as we discussed earlier, it's not just biomechanical issues that can cause these kinds of injuries. The other pieces to that puzzle aren't quite as well understood yet, but they're still important, which is exactly why Gus and his team wanted to look into them.
I think where our group kind of got interested is, yeah, we're going to still consider the mechanics, right? Because we know what is probably a high risk movement pattern, but we know that movement is kind of governed by this magical control system, right? And so we kind of wanted to say, all right, we want to look at this, still look at mechanics related to ACL injury, but we want to look at it more from a motor control or a neuromuscular control perspective and stuff like that.
And what they found basically came down to 2 ideas. First, they used a beep test to get their subjects, who are all collegiate athletes, to a level of fatigue that would mirror what they'd be in a game. So, not at the point of exhaustion, which is what one of the other studies in that group looked at, but to a point where it was at least a little uncomfortable. And from that lab test, they found that when it was isolated, fatigue did have an effect on the athlete's ability to move properly. And that makes sense. Our brains don't work as well when we're tired and running out of energy. But in the second part of the experiment, Gus and his team tested the athletes' differences in movement between trials where they were told which way to move and trials when they weren't. And that matters, because whether or not you know where you're going to go next is an important part of how well and how safely you can get there.
I can't really like pre-plan my movement. Like as a basketball player, I can't say I'm going to drive to that spot in the lane and I'm going to, do a jump stop and shoot a jump shot. I kind of have to initiate my movement and then react to what's happening in my environment. If athletes had to do these cognitively demanding movements, or they have to move in response to external stimuli and things like that. Now, what happens when they're in a fatigue state and potentially there's central effects of fatigue and their ability to process information is compromised a little bit? Does that manifest itself in higher risk mechanics?
And according to their results, yes, it sure does. Which brings us back to Derrick Rose. His injury happened in the fourth quarter of a playoff game, in a situation where he wasn't able to plan exactly where his next movement would be, and when he was at a high level of fatigue. And that, according to Gus, is exactly the kind of scenario that could be managed, if not prevented altogether, with better understanding of the components involved.
His was a classic non-contact injury, right? So, we like the Joe Burrow injury, the somebody falls on your leg, it's hard to prevent, you know what I mean? But actually most ACL injuries are non-contact, like 75 to 80 to 90%, depending on what studies you look at, are just an athlete doing a cut or doing a land and the knee just kind of gives out on them.
Mm-hmm.
And so that to me also points to this being more of a motor control problem than a pure, hey, we just need to do better with bracing or rules to protect athletes from getting hit.
And that idea, the notion that certain injuries are just down to an individual athlete's motor control in a given moment, is a big deal, because it's not like they're going to be able to eliminate those situations completely. In pretty much every case, reacting to stuff going on around them is part of the game and can't really be avoided. Even after they've spent months letting the injury recover and going through painful rehab and preparing their bodies as best they can, that uncertainty can still be there. To continue playing at the highest level, you have to believe in your body's ability to move the way you tell it to, and that belief, whether it's conscious or subconscious, may or may not have anything to do with how healthy the tissue actually is.
From a peer, like their perception of their abilities, their confidence in being able to execute movements, their fear of re-injury, that's a major issue for a lot of athletes. Like we'll look at their range of motion they have at the knee or how much strength they have. And obviously right after the surgery, most athletes, when they have an ACL injury, but this is true of any injury, they'll have surgery to kind of reconstruct the ligament. And then they go through kind of standard post-operative rehabilitation. By about 6 months, 6 to 9 months, they're probably ready to go back to sport. But a lot of them are still very apprehensive about it, about loading the limb again. They're worried they're going to re-injure it and things like that. There's been some studies that have said, athletes who have higher fear of re-injury, they tend to show more of a pattern where they don't load their limb anymore. Even if it's structurally fine, like, right, if I pulled on the graft, it would still give good stability to the knee and their strength may be okay. But their, perception is that they're not ready to go back to sport. You know what I mean? Or they have high fear of re-injury and stuff like that.
So, with all that in mind, let's reconsider the case of Derrick Rose. After the injury occurred, Rose sat out the next 6 to 8 months that his doctors told him to, exactly like Gus described. But then, even as the team doctors cleared him and the Bulls were making a surprise run in the early rounds of the playoffs, Rose continued to sit out. He said that he didn't have the kind of muscle memory that he wanted to be able to play with the aggressiveness and fluidity that had gotten him to an MVP level before that. And I think you could make a pretty easy argument that he never really got that back, and that lack of fluidity could have been a contributing factor to all the injuries he suffered later. Major injuries are a kind of trauma, and when you combine dealing with that with the normal physical and mental rigors that world-class athletes deal with, it's easy to see how someone would never get back to feeling quote-unquote right. And it's important to point out here that that feeling of rightness transcends just the physical. Rose's medical reports may have shown that he was ready to play, or that the knee was healthy, but he couldn't just go back to being the MVP version of himself that the fans wanted to see. And how do you really explain that to people who aren't you and don't fully understand how your body feels to you in a given moment?
That's a hard conversation to have because you're right. Like medically, we look at it and it's like, you look at it and you're like, hey, the ligament is fine, or whatever you're doing. If it's a fracture or whatever it is, you're looking at it and you're like, hey, you might do an x-ray follow-up or something like that. You're like, hey, the tissue's fine, your strength is fine, your emotion's fine. You're in a time where you should be going back to sport. And as clinicians, we're like, hey, it's ready it's time to go. And a lot of times we communicate that to the coaching staff. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And the coaching staff says, hey, the medical team says you're ready to go. And the athlete's kind of left on the outside saying, I don't feel ready to go. You know what I mean?
Gus and other clinicians and researchers like him are trying to figure out the best way to strike that balance. Because as much as the team's needs matter, and they do, because that's who everyone works for, the players' cognition and perception of their own readiness are just as important. And to really hammer that home, I'm going to give you another example. Well, really, it's two examples, but you'll see what I mean in a minute. I want you to ponder, for a moment, the 2019 NBA Finals between the Golden State Warriors and the Toronto Raptors. The Raptors were in the finals largely on the back of Kawhi Leonard, who'd been there for a season after successfully getting himself out of San Antonio the summer before. Now, there was a lot of drama surrounding Kawhi's exit from the Spurs, but the main sticking point was his recovery from a mysterious quad injury. And this went on for like 9 months, so obviously there was a lot more to it than what I'm about to tell you, but basically, the Spurs wanted Kawhi to come back, and Kawhi was adamant that he was going to manage his own recovery, whether they liked it or not. And a year later, there he was, collecting his finals MVP award for the team that the Spurs traded him to. But in that same finals, another player who'd been out hurt for a while was busting his butt to get back to the court as fast as possible. Kevin Durant had strained his calf pretty badly in the Western Conference semis against the Rockets, but to try and get back in time for the finals, which the Warriors did end up making, he'd done his rehab about as quickly as possible. And to be fair, the doctors cleared him for Game 5 of the finals, and I'm not here to argue with them. But remember that being medically cleared for something does not mean that there aren't cognitive impairments that could be just as dangerous. Kevin Durant's first live basketball in over a month was in an elimination game in the NBA Finals, literally the most stressful and cognitively demanding environment that he could have been dropped into. And as he turned to back down the Raptors' Serge Ibaka, Kevin Durant planted his injured right foot and ruptured his Achilles. Now, I don't bring those two things up to say that one is completely right and one is completely wrong. Kawhi's treatment of his team wasn't a great look, and Durant was just working with the sound medical advice he'd gotten, but I mention all of that, as well as Derrick Rose, to hopefully reinforce the idea that a player's perception of how they're feeling matters. Thankfully, Kevin Durant fully recovered and is back kicking butt and taking names, but for whatever reason, Derrick Rose didn't. Not completely, anyway. And he said it himself. A big part of that was not feeling like he could get to the place mentally that he used to. I think it's pretty clear that that initial injury and the fallout from it afterward kind of freaked him out. And that's completely understandable. Sometimes it's more than just what it says on the x-ray or what you can do in a physical therapy gym. The real situations are as unscripted as they are unforgiving, and if you're not ready for them, that's a real concern. Because what happens between the lines of a basketball court or a football field may have significantly less to do with whether an athlete truly recovers from an injury than what happens between their own ears. Cheers to everyone out there enjoying the last part of this NBA season. I'm Will, and I'm a Die Easy Hornets fan, so it never gets too stressful over here. If you like this video, or if you're a Bulls fan and just enjoy getting to relive the peak Rose years a little bit, leave us a like and be sure to subscribe for more content. I know it may seem like common sense that fear of re-injury or lack of confidence would impact your recovery, but I hope you still learned something. Because in all walks of life, a person's cognition matters, and not paying attention to it can have pretty disastrous effects. I love getting to see guys like Kevin Durant get back to their former selves, though. Here's hoping we get more of that kind of thing in the future, and less of the other one. On that note, it's time for me to head out, so be safe, take care of yourselves out there, and I'll see you all next time.